Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. On behalf of UNICEF's Evaluation Office, EVALSDGs, and we welcome you to this webinar that in this case it's being done in partnership with CLEAR Anglophone Africa. We are delighted to start this webinar with over 130 participants. That's a very good number from people from all over the world. I have seen participants from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and North America, and MENA as well. The webinar today is called Using Evidence in Policy and Practice. It's based on a book, and the book will be further explained by Ian Goldman, who is one of our main speakers this morning, afternoon, or evening. Before introducing Ian, who at the time will also introduce the other panelists, who will be in charge of introducing the other panelists, let me explain to you our ground rules and also what is coming after. Participants will be muted by the organizer of this webinar to avoid background noises. We will have a Q&A session, and when the Q&A is open, you will have the possibility to write your questions in the chat bar. If there is a need for you to speak, you can signal that in the chat bar, and we will see the possibility to allow you to speak. The recording of this webinar, as well as the resource materials and the presentations, will be shared with you all and with all the networks a few days after the webinar. I understand that some of you have audio problems. We have tested and all is working on our end, so you may need to check the audio at your end. So that's it from now. We will have 75 minutes webinar. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Ian Goldman. Professor Ian Goldman is an advisor on evaluation and evidence systems for CLEAR Anglophone Africa. He is the former Deputy Director in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation of South Africa. Ian has worked for 40 years in 20 countries on issues of rural development, decentralization, sustainable livelihoods approaches, community-driven development, and evidence-based policy making and implementation. Ian, welcome, and thank you very, very much for your continued support. Before I give the floor to you, may I ask participants and presenters, when they are not speaking, to please mute their videos because there is a bit of background noise. So every time a speaker is speaking, well, please unmute yourself. When you are not speaking, please kindly mute yourself. May I also ask you to put your camera on so the audience will be able to see you. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ian.
Hello, everybody. Good to be with you. And as Ada said, we're research, which is research that was done of 8 case studies in the whole of West Africa, actually, trying to unpack the lessons from these countries of how evidence has actually been used to influence policy and practice. And it's linked with the Twendembele program, which is a program of African governments promoting M&E. And we've deliberately chosen a number of different types of evidence sources. So evaluations, research, rapid synthesis, and citizens engagement. And we're trying to understand what supported evidence used to happen. And we're very much taking a policymaker perspective on this. The policymakers were co-authors of the chapters, and we're not taking a researcher perspective, but a policymaker perspective. And all the participants, the researchers, are all African citizens themselves. We're all African citizens, and so it's very much an African analysis that we hope will influence policy and practice in the continent. The book is going to be coming out in July, and we're taking one chapter at a time and looking at those in turn. And this webinar is looking particularly at chapter 5, which is about the Department of Basic Education in South Africa and how they have taken on evaluations. And we have with us both the researcher Nelson Popiwa, who used to be in CLEAR and is now with the National Consumer Commission in South Africa, and he was the researcher on this case study, and Carol Nuga Deliwe, who's the Chief Director in the Department of Basic Education and is charged with policy research, evaluation, M&E in the department. And she's actually been a key player, and she's going to be actually presenting on the DBE part of the Department of Basic Education part. You can see the other chapters. There's one on an evaluation of violence against women and children, public procurement evaluation in Uganda, an innovative rapid response service in Makerere University in Uganda, an evaluation of the Benin agriculture sector, an interesting example of Parliament promoting citizen engagement for the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act in Kenya, and sanitation in Ghana, and a very interesting example around tobacco control in West Africa. And we're going to go through each of these over the successive months. My co-editor on this journey has been Mine Pabari, who's a CLEAR research fellow, but also runs a consultancy based in Kenya. And we've sort of been leading this work, but with this 39 other authors and co-authors from across Africa. And we've done this work building on an analytical framework that draws on work of others, and this is not an academic audience, so I won't go into the detail on that. But what this framework does is to try and allow us to unpack the effectiveness of these evidence interventions and how these aim to support decision makers' use of evidence, and what interventions were done around the actual generation of evidence to support the use of evidence. And we're trying to get an analytical tool to explore these interventions, which allowed us to structure the research and to try and identify patterns across the different case studies. Now, this is what the analytical framework looks like, and I'm going to unpack it briefly. And what you can see is that we start off with the context, the external context, the macro context, interrelationships across government and with non-state agents, and then there are internal dimensions in terms of the organizations, in terms of leadership, culture, the capacity, etc. And because we're taking very much a policymaker perspective, we start with a demand box, because we're not, I mean, a lot of the evidence-based policy discussion is very much from a researcher starting point, but we're very much taking the starting point of African governments who want to introduce evidence to improve what they do. And so the first step in the evidence journey is actually generating the evidence. And there are a number of issues that one can take on board there, the type of evidence, the quality, etc., in terms of that evidence that's actually generated. But then there are a number of interventions, and we call them evidence use interventions, things that are done to try and promote the use of the evidence. And these can range from training interventions, capacity building interventions. They can be around awareness. They can be around trying to promoting access to the evidence. And a lot of it's actually around trying to promote ownership of the evidence, and that's something that comes out quite strongly in the work. And these evidence use interventions trigger a number of sort of unconscious processes which happen in people, and we're using a behavior change lens here. So these change mechanisms are about building awareness, building agreement, promoting access, building trust and interaction relationships, building ability and an institutionalization process. And through those, this should lead to increased motivation to use evidence, increased capability to use evidence, and increased opportunities to use evidence. And it's very much this link between the use intervention, how this triggers the change mechanism, and that's how this leads to increases in capability, motivation, and opportunity that we've been trying to explore and trying to become much more purposive about in our work. And if that happens, then we hope that the evidence will be taken on. It'll be used either in an individual way, in an organizational way, in a systems way, and that will lead to changes in policy and practice. And if those changes in policy and practice, we hope, will result in a development impact. So that's just a broad introduction. As you go through some of the slides, you'll notice some of these columns on the left, just to show you the link with the framework as we go through. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Carol, who's going to then go through the Department of Basic Education case. And I realize this is actually the wrong presentation. Thomas, this is the wrong presentation.
Okay.
Okay.
Give me 1 second.
Let me. This presentation is actually the one we're seeing at the moment is actually one that we used 3 weeks ago, which is a more generic one where we went through the overall lessons from the project, as opposed to this particular one, which is on the actual this particular case.
Would you like me to try and upload?
I think you upload me now.
Okay.
May
Yes,
I?
Maybe could we maybe take a couple of questions while Mina's just doing that? Or yes, no. Why don't you go? You go ahead, Carol. You introduce the department, and you could take even the first slide or two while Mina is uploading.
Absolutely. Can you hear me? So, hello everybody. My name is Carol. I work in the Department of Basic Education in South Africa at the national level. In South Africa, basic education is responsible for schools, 26,000 schools, about 12 million learners, and it has 9 provincial departments which implement various programs in these schools. So the national department is responsible for monitoring, for oversight, for policy development, as in a lot of other countries. So there's a concurrent function, if you like, for basic education in the sector. So I will use the basic education system and schooling system interchangeably in this presentation, just to give you a sense of the institutional arrangements. And so there are quite a lot of programs from early childhood development, nutrition programs, bursary programs for improving teacher supply in the sector, as well as other programs relating to curriculum reform, early grade reading, scholar transport, etc. in the basic education sector. Obviously teacher development amongst others. And so about 7-8 years ago, we decided to look at some of these very large programs in the sector and how really we're implementing them firstly, but also what the possible impact is. Among some of these evaluations, we then decided to do some evaluations, and it was really a strategic decision to do this. A, to help us to be better at what we do in the public sector and in the contribution to development, but B, also to help into the system was introduced in 2007, and the National School Nutrition Program, which has been in place for 14, 15 years now. And CAPS is the curriculum policy, basically assessment policy, and then the early grade reading study, which is an impact evaluation, and scholar transport, as I mentioned. So we decided to go into these because we spend a lot of millions of rand on these programs, and originally wanted to do impact evaluations in almost all of them. And you can see that in only 2 areas were we able to have enough information to do the impact evaluation. So in the other programs, the evaluations, we know that we will be able to do more work. We ended up doing implementation evaluation, and that's really useful in the journey towards impact evaluations. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, the main focus of our chapter is on the Funza Lushaka bursary program, providing bursaries for student teachers to fill gaps in the teaching workforce in particular subjects and in remote rural schools serving poor communities. The second, the National School Nutrition Program feeds 9 million out of the 12 million learners. So 3/4 of the learners in our schools at least 1 meal a day, and in most cases more than 1 meal. The intention is obviously for the nutrition program, as in most other countries. I know in Latin America there are programs like this, but also in Asia, to improve concentration in school and school attendance, and therefore get better learning. So we really went out of our way to involve and to get ownership, to make sure that the program managers who sit outside the monitoring unit in the department, and I'll speak a bit about the monitoring unit and the role of the monitoring unit in doing these evaluations, but also in the improvement planning process. We really had a lot of work around just making sure the evaluations were used within the policy space, but also by the right people. As a result of these evaluations, implementation evaluations for the Funza Lushaka bursary system, for instance, the teacher bursary system, the department introduced guidelines and criteria for better selection of students based on their geographic subject area, and stricter selection criteria, stricter monitoring of the students and the beneficiaries. So we had a sort of instrumental use of the evaluation. The evaluation showed us where there were real gaps, both at provincial level, but also in planning the placement and the management and the support of these bursary holders. These bursary holders receive a bursary through the Department of Basic Education, but they happen to go to school and to be trained in the higher education sector. So there was quite a lot of coordination and improvements that were made as a result of the evaluation recommendations. We also were able to program and managed to put a case to Treasury and obtained funding for an online system to manage this program. And really, that's been in use for the last 2 years. We were also able to build a better placement system for graduating students. And this initial Teacher Education Directorate, which was now reporting not just on the administrative parts of placements, but also where graduates were placed on completion, and therefore were part of the planning, better strengthened planning of the supply of teachers at provincial level and overall in the teaching workforce. The most important thing that we found in carrying out the evaluation was just the participation of various people across the sectors responsible for training teachers, but also in terms of demand for the teachers and their services, the basic education sector. We also had participation of people from the financial aid scheme. The bursary is a financial aid package. Civil society groups interested, but also unions, provincial and national departments just to get a better understanding of this bursary program. So we had a conceptual process use. We had a better engagement and communication for the first time probably with all provinces and national department officials involved from sort of right through the value chain of this program. We were also able to use this, the evaluation, to feed into other conversations in the department on teacher and dialogues on teacher professionalizing, teacher standards, school-based teacher education models, etc. So that we use this evaluation and the participants in this evaluation then to take forward some other work that the department wanted to do in the teaching space. So initially we had a lot of interest in just the numbers of teachers and how many are trained, etc. But through the evaluation, we also had a lot of more interest in just how teacher supply and demand works, how graduates are placed, what the logistical but also the labor absorption concerns are about the whole teacher planning sector in the department and in the sector and in the country much broadly. So Parliament was much more interested. The Auditor General, usually traditionally interested in numbers only, was much more interested in the process of teacher supply and how streamlined that was, but also our colleagues in the higher education sector. So that was unintended, but this was the result of this evaluation, because we drew a lot of people into the process and were able to use this evaluation in that way to help organizational change and improvement, but also to help the sector implementation to improve. Next slide, please. In relation to the school nutrition program, we had various, quite a long set of recommendations out of the evaluation. Again, an implementation evaluation. We will be looking to, in the next few years, to do an impact evaluation, because we'll have better systems to do that. But in terms of the implementation of this nutrition program, we had all sorts of recommendations around how there should be oversight, how to strengthen that, but also about the program itself, the specifications around the meals, the preferences of how we collect information about the preferences of children, wastage, recommendations about how to reduce wastage, stock control, management, etc., but also the role of both the schools and the people who are preparing, as well as the officials who are supervising this. We had a lot of guidelines that then came out of the department engaging with these recommendations and using them to improve the nutrition program and acceptability of certain parts of the menus, certain parts, compliance of manufacturers, quality assurance of the food that is presented, as well as management. So I think that was really, really useful. In the chapter, we also talk about issues relating to sort of the particular menu choices, alternatives to soya as protein in meals, because we found through the evaluation that the soya protein is not necessarily something that is a choice, the menu of choice for a lot of young people in the sector. And that was useful because we were able to then consult with nutrition experts in our engagements and during the evaluation to make recommendations around it. So like the Funza Lushaka bursary system, through the nutrition program, we had a better sense of what the activity should be across the whole of the government value chain, but also out into the provider and the civil society monitoring and the student preferences. So we're able to make a better program out of it. And there are opportunities for better implementation, better utility. And even now, in terms of the conceptual use, that was clear, and that's clear in the evaluation documentation, all of which is on the internet, and all of which is available on the Department of Planning and Monitoring and Evaluation website, as well as ours. Next slide, please. We also had, so these youth interventions in terms of DBE, we were able to apply some of these interventions, these youth interventions. The department, we were able to effect certain change mechanisms within the organization, but also within the sector, the broader sector, outside of just the department and the policymakers within the department, to our stakeholders and the partners on whom we rely to make these things work. So what was very clear was the knowledge brokering role of the unit, the chief directorate that I'm responsible for, in using its own position in terms of developing strategy, planning, monitoring, and providing policy briefings on strategic priorities within the education sector. We were able to then use this background and this sense of trust with the program managers, first to build awareness, but also to help them through navigating the use and the institutionalization of the evaluation, but also responses to the evaluation afterwards. We're fortunate because the unit is technically strong. We do a lot of quantitative analysis in the unit, but also that helped us because we have that role and that status in the sector, and therefore we're able to win over some skeptical people within the sector, but also we're able to legitimize some of the findings right through, not just from the design of the evaluations, but also post-evaluation in terms of implementation. Just winning people over, making them understand how important it is to do things better. And I think that's how our angle was. This is about you doing things better, not about showing you up. We were able to also use the work that we do normally, which is providing overview reports on sector performance and the trends in the sector, to insert the evaluations into strategic presentations. The Council of Education Ministers, for instance, the heads of education in provincial and national level meet every 6 weeks, and we're able to insert some of these evaluations in. Obviously, there were many discussions and conversations around the findings, methodology, but we were able to help to showcase the findings in different fora and to build trust in both data analysis, but also in the evaluation results, and to showcase some of the evaluation findings. Finally, before I hand over to my colleague, we were also, in terms of just the kinds of youth interventions, we had an evaluation steering committee, which was really a co-chaired between the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, which provided the technical advice on the national evaluation system, and supported us as the department to push through the implementation of evaluations, and helped us to think through some of the steps. We found common understanding of how the program worked really helped, was very valuable, both in the process, but also in including stakeholders as part of the process. It was for instance, with one of the evaluations, it was the first time all provincial, local, and civil society and national officials had sat in one place since the program had been developed years and years ago. And they found it very useful, just developing the terms of reference, terms of the theory of change with the stakeholders, and that really helped with the process of use post the evaluation. We also had a series of validation workshops. We had an accessible report, and that helped also post the evaluation to institutionalize and disseminate the findings, but also within the department to start the process of getting program managers and policymakers to engage with improvement as a result of the evaluation. And we then obviously had a report. I mentioned the public report. We had a cabinet process. that really the DPME, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, had worked out to bring all these evaluations into the public. Initially, when we started, we were very little concerned about being so open about implementation concerns. But as we developed and we were able to bring these to the agenda of the senior strategists and senior policymakers, we realized also the approach of the government of South Africa in terms of implementation improvement and in terms of the DPME particularly work encouraged us, provided the context for this. So approval by cabinet helped cabinet to take the evaluation seriously and helped to change the ecosystem of evidence use within the broader sector, basic education sector. So I've spoken about the role of the DPME. It's very important to have a national focus, and it's very important to have a national support for using evaluations, for encouraging evidence-based policy making within government. I'll hand over to my colleague now.
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon to everyone. I hope that you can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay, so Carol was talking about some of the mechanisms that were in place to make sure use happened, and also some of the enabling factors on what really made use to happen. I just want to talk about context, because context really matters. What we saw to be sort of an external dimension as well as an internal dimension. One of the participants in the workshops that we had actually mentioned the fact that for him, he viewed the Department of Basic Education as one which had been able to institutionalize the use of evidence. So then in so doing, you will see, for example, that what are those critical aspects that made him and many others to concur that the department had been able to institutionalize evidence? What kind of things had been sort of the drivers, or at least the contextual issues that facilitated that use? One of those is that when you look at the Department of Basic Education, it is probably the only department where stability in terms of political leadership has occurred over the past, possibly the decade. If you look at it, for example, the Minister of Basic Education has been in place since 2009. So over these years, she has had the political will to actually support independent evaluation, and in a way to also use evidence, and even to use, even in some cases, just descriptive statistics. You may remember that for those who have been following what happens in South Africa, is that she is well known for being at the forefront, particularly when it comes to even presenting student performance results. She's always out there and bringing that up in terms of discussing with the public. Another important aspect was more of a stimulus, or something to stimulate the need to change business as usual, particularly when it comes to evidence, was what happened in 2012, which we now commonly know as the 2012 textbook crisis. It was when, in that year, learners were unable to receive learning support materials, which is something that is part of the provision of basic education in this country, which is that the Department of Basic Education supplies, through obviously service providers and the provincial departments, textbooks to schools. And in that year, that failed to happen. And probing further into that matter, there were other discussions that then showed that indeed the department was not always aware of what was actually happening on the ground. And so this led to a proactive response, in a reaction by the department, which made them to realize the need to now put in place management information systems that are able to track and trace what is happening, and also to monitor the progress of implementation. The other aspect are champions, and we all know the importance of champions. We always see whenever projects are happening that there might be the systems in place, but if there is not that one person or that one team that is able to run with a project, it might just not succeed. In the case of the Department of Basic Education, we see the setting up of what was initially a policy unit or a policy support unit in the early 2000s, which then eventually morphed into a bigger unit, which is a Chief Directorate for Strategic Planning, Research and Coordination. Inside that particular directorate sits, that Chief Directorate sits a Directorate for Research and Evaluations. And these staff in that department, as we have already heard in the previous discussion that Carol has mentioned, have the technical expertise, and they were able to promote some of the use of that evidence. They actually played an important role in helping their peers who manage programs to appreciate the value of lessons from evaluations. So what they were able to do was to speak to their peers, to encourage them and to include them in each and every process, from planning to implementation of the evaluations themselves, including improvement planning and reporting and progress tracking and the like. And also, they also played what we would feel is sort of a brokerage role. And that is very critical, because we found that to be very important, particularly because they were able to provide a technically strong partnership to DPME. So in some cases, the Department of Public Monitoring and Evaluation, Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, sometimes would appear to be too technically advanced for certain government departments. But when it worked with the Department of Basic Education, that wasn't the case, because staff within the department were able to converse at that level and were able to also give in their input. More importantly is that within South Africa itself, the National Evaluation System came into being. And as we see, with the National Evaluation System emerging and the department's readiness already by the time of the National Evaluation System coming into play, is that the readiness of the department to have already been implementing or instituting evaluations or conducting M&E projects then meant they were already on the bend, in the system, and were able to now pick up and pick onto and latch onto this. So that already was a good enabler for evaluation use. Now, what could have been barriers to use? It's not always the positive side that happens when we talk about issues of use. In terms of barriers to use, we could think about how in some parts of the improvement plans, there was sometimes reluctance to implement parts of the improvement plans because some of the activities would have negative political implications, sometimes inconsistent with the law, and sometimes it was just too expensive to implement. In some cases, impractical, or sometimes it was lack of management support, or it required policy amendment. And once you get into a process where policy has to be amended, it also takes a bit more time than what would have been expected, or more time than what project managers are able to use. And then also what we find is that in other evaluations, there was hesitation by some managers in undertaking the evaluations right from the onset. And in some cases, it was associated with uncertainty of the value of those evaluations and concerns about underperformance and repercussions. For other evaluations, legitimacy where the service provider was appointed in the competitive bidding process was also a renowned critic of government programs. So you can imagine if you were to use a bidder that already had a negative attitude towards the functions and the utilization of evaluations by the department, it then makes it a little bit more difficult for them to also play a positive and a more objective role. Now, what are some of the outcomes that have been as a result of this? We see that the knowledge broker role has been transferred. We see that in some cases now, officials within the department, not just within the Chief Directorate of Strat Planning and Research and Monitoring and Evaluation, but my own experience working with, let's say, the program manager for the National School Feeding Program, is the enthusiasm that they have had with regards to now taking on the results from that M&E, from that evaluation, and running with them as if they were their own projects that they had done right from the onset. And it tells you that indeed that role is quite critical for them. Also, we see joint communication capacity was developed and using evidence and shared experiences. In some cases, you will find that there was a leak about the outcome of the National School Nutrition Program as implementation evaluation results. And that happened instead of stimulating a negative interest, it actually stimulated positive interest in government evaluations by civil society. One thing I could probably mention is that if you look at a school feeding program or a school nutrition program, is that it is a program in which certain people have business interests, particularly those who supply the needs of those learners, particularly those who are meal providers or those who are going to actually be the ones running the programs at school level. Now, leaking those results of that evaluation could have worked in their favor if they had posted that the implementation of that evaluation was working or was there was underperformance in that area. That could have built a case for them, maybe for extra funding or whatever. But unfortunately, what then happened was that civil society began to realize and appreciate that government was actually evaluating its own performance and that it was being transparent about what was working and what was not working. Also within the department itself, and even for the DPME which it was working with, is that these evaluations have stimulated interest in developing reporting tools and data systems. The program managers, the stakeholders who work in this project are continuously developing some of the tools that they need. Also, stakeholder reporting strengthened in relation to accountability for placement, enrollment, and monitoring. We also see that external auditors are beginning to understand those changes. As we know with the public sector, that for the most part, auditors are always in almost in a sense the more critical stakeholders that everybody talks about. It's always about what will the auditors say, oh, this could lead to an audit finding if we don't do it properly. But in this case, the auditors themselves, the external ones, also read the report and they were able to appreciate it. And also, we also see that the evaluation itself, it led to benefits in strengthened internal relationships. It also helped communication to encourage evidence use. My experience with some of the program managers as well who worked who were in charge of the programs that were evaluated also showed that for them, bringing in participants in a room to develop a theory of change was something that led to them really beginning to appreciate the importance of evaluations and also the importance of then taking up that evidence for use purposes. I would say that the cases that we presented in this chapter, these are evaluations where the evidence and recommendations from the evaluations themselves were used. We appreciated the knowledge broker role of the Chief Directorate because it was the one that was critical in leading the use of these evaluations. And we also appreciated that the constant need to reinforce the utility of the evaluations was a stumbling block, but it was overcome by consistently communicating the benefits. When you see a program manager who is supposedly supposed to only concentrate on ensuring that at the end of the year, in their annual performance plan, they have met the targets or exceeded them. When you see such a person beginning to say, this is what my program is doing in terms of its implementation, in terms of outcomes, then you know that, and when you see them beginning to speak from an evaluative thinking perspective, you can appreciate that there's something that the relationship between that directorate and that particular program would have done. In fact, even in us asking for videos and other kinds of evidence to use in order to showcase this project, we could see the enthusiasm and the willingness to participate by the same program managers because they felt they were contributing something. I remember another one said to me, just seeing ministers sitting around the table and discussing their report was something they found to be very rewarding because they felt proud of the work that they were doing. And even though there was low levels of understanding about the need for evaluation by some of the program managers I'm referring to and their initial reservations about evaluations, eventually this has strengthened their program, these program managers in terms of their reviewing and the way they strengthen policy implementation. And if we look at this case that we've presented to you, it provides a picture of how a government department can undertake evaluations effectively and the importance of an internal knowledge broker to champion and support this. It also shows you the usefulness of a national evaluation system providing key elements that encourage use. Ian, perhaps I should revert back to you to finalize the discussion.
Okay, so this is just the book that's and which is available now, and we also have a series of webinars that are coming forward. The next webinar will be on the 3rd of June, where we will be looking at the case of the citizen engagement in the revisions of the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act in Kenya. But with that, I think we're open for questions. So I think the idea is that you put your questions in the chat box, and then Mine will moderate the questions and come up with, suggest which of us should answer which questions.
Nitsin, I think you ended the presentation. My connection dropped, so I can't load it again. Can you go back? Are you able to do that?
Sorry, yeah, I kind of noticed that. Will you be able to?
It's not allowing me to share the slides anymore.
Okay, let me try from my side.
Shall I do it? But you do it, and then if you can, yeah.
And try from your side, Ian.
Okay, but I'm sure we can take questions now anyway.
Yeah.
Can I upload it from my side, Ian?
It says it's uploading, but meanwhile, yeah, I think it's coming.
Okay. In the meantime, a couple of questions have started going up, so maybe we can take those.
So okay. Well, the first one is not about it's not about this particular case, but the qualitative, quantitative, and I think the issue is you need to use the right methodology for the evaluation you're conducting. There's no right answer about quantitative or qualitative, and in fact, in most cases, you need both. So it's deciding on what's needed for the evaluation questions that you've got. Nina, over to you for any further ones that we should be allocating.
Okay, so maybe the second one can go to Carol. Did you do any capacity building? Sorry, the screen jumps around. Did you do any capacity building of the education department staff in order to foster technical understanding, sustainability to evaluate projects on their own in the future? Carol, do you want to take that?
Thank you. Yes, so there was a lot of technical capacity building, yes, of us in the department, but also hello, there was I think I seem to have been cut off. There was capacity building of us in the department or the department staff during the evaluations, but also there continues to be capacity building so that people can participate, but also run evaluations in the future. So absolutely. It's not something that the department itself does necessarily, but within government, there's an evidence-based approach to policy making. But I do recognize the fact that it does need to be done, and it does need to be done very well. So absolutely. There is currently interest in other sorts of evaluations, not just implementation and impact evaluations, but other sorts that Ian had mentioned. And that's really something that at provincial level, but also within departments and within government, is high on the priority list.
Thanks, Carol. Do you want to just go on a little bit? There's a question here about the theory of change, and it's asking about why the theory of change was developed during the evaluation as opposed to design.
Excellent, thank you. So in the ideal world of government programs, we would go through the whole cycle, starting from design right through to impact evaluations. And we had a program which had been in delivery mode, if you like, implemented over 13, 14 years. We could not find in our first conversations, in the research, in the literature review, a comprehensive theory of change. So we decided to, with the stakeholders, to develop one and to document it, codify it, so that we all understood it and bought into it. And that's basically why we decided to have a theory of change, particularly for a program that was active at different levels in government. So in the ideal world, it would be great, but we decided to use this opportunity then to bring in more participants and to include more stakeholders and develop a theory of change de novo.
Thank you. Nedson, there's a couple of questions here around barriers and the wider context. The first one talks about the, sorry, it's very difficult because the chat keeps jumping around. Sorry, here. One, can you elaborate on the barrier on the credibility of the evaluators teams? If I can just put them all together. The second one is around what happens when you don't have a champion. How do you build up a culture of evaluation value? The third one speaks to fear of repercussions as one of the challenges. How big an issue was it and how did you overcome it? Perhaps you can speak to those three.
Is that for Nedson?
Yes. Nedson here?
I'm just noting what happens when you don't what?
Okay, let me just try and go through them again. Okay, the first one is further down. How do you overcome barriers to evidence use? And then there's a couple that are related to specific barriers. The first one is the barrier on the credibility of the evaluators' teams. Can you elaborate on that? The second one is what happens if there are no champions? How do you build up a culture of evaluation value? And the third one speaks to the fear of repercussions as one of the challenges that was faced. How big an issue was it? And were there any strategies on how one might overcome it?
Okay, all right. On the credibility of teams, I think my take would have been, we were speaking about, I hope I do understand where the question is coming from, but credibility here, we're referring to the fact that in this particular instance, when you have a department, or at least because a department that is going to roll out an evaluation, or at least is going to work together with the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation to hold an evaluation using a service provider, that particular team in itself had people who had the skills to actually do monitoring and evaluation projects themselves. They have M&E skills. So when you have people who are skilled enough, it means even when they outsource that project to service providers, they are also knowledgeable about shaping the project, keeping in line with the scope, and making sure that everything falls into place, because they are equally themselves skilled in the area of monitoring and evaluation. Because one of the challenges we have come across is that sometimes you can commission a project, but yourself, or at least if that team that is commissioning the project is not equally skilled, then you find that in some cases, then they take what the service provider is giving to them, and in some cases, the contractor or the consultant might just be leading them on a wrong path. Now, you also talked about fear of repercussions. I think one of the key issues here is that everybody would have seen an evaluation of their own program as something that might lead to certain results. And if those results come out showing that they are underperforming, or at least that there are certain things that they are not repercussions under the usual consequence management structures that they have in the department. But in this case, I think the fear of repercussions could have been that it would paint them in a bad light, that they are not performing or that they are not producing results. Yet the evaluations themselves then did almost the opposite, because they are the ones that actually helped them to begin to understand that, well, whilst you are delivering, for example, in the case of the nutrition program, whilst you are delivering soya meals from food made of, let's say, soya beans or soya beans and the like, the learners actually don't have a preference for that particular meal, even though you're doing it so well. So it helped them to also get into understanding the quality of some of the delivery of their own programs, particularly in the feeding area. The other issue is that having a champion, I think it's an important aspect, maybe because monitoring and evaluations are probably, let's say, in an early stage in certain parts of government departments in the country. Certain government departments have not uptaken M&E, even when the Department of Public Monitoring Evaluation has said, bring forth your own plans for what you want to evaluate. They have not submitted plans simply because of perhaps maybe the preparedness of such departments. Now, you need in such departments, you need champions, and those champions could be, like in this case, a department within that particular, a directorate within a department that can then be able to interface with the DPME in order to get evaluations running. Or the other issue is that the champions, yes, whilst it's important to have champions at a lower level, but having champions particularly at the very senior management level really helps to get the buy-in that you require. Because even when it comes to, because this is a national department and it still has to cascade this to provincial level. So having the very senior top being champions also helps in cascading some of these youth interventions at provincial level. I may have missed one or two questions, but I hope at least I touched on some of them.
Thanks, Nedson. The next couple of questions are for Carol. They really are asking about the evaluation process itself. The first one is, can you tell us a little bit more about the approaches that were used, the evaluation approaches that were used, impact, developmental, etc., and were staff involved? The next one speaks to data sharing and security, and were there any data sharing and security issues between the government and stakeholders, and how did you deal with them? And the third one asks about negative findings. Were there negative findings? And again, how did you communicate them?
Okay, can I just ask about the first one? I didn't quite get that. It broke, the network broke.
Sorry, that one was asking about the evaluation approaches. Can you speak a little bit more? Yeah.
Okay.
So impact, yeah?
All right. Thank you. So, may I? So, we wanted impact evaluations. We wanted to see what the impact of most of these multi-million rand, very large programs are. The National School Nutrition Program was at that time worth about 4 to 5 billion rand, feeding 9 million children out of the 12 in the country, and in the schooling system. So absolutely, we wanted impact evaluations to see if we're doing what we wanted. We ended up doing implementation evaluations for all sorts of reasons, including the lack of data, the lack of a theory of change that was actually sort of clearly understood by everybody, but mainly data and engagement with that. I think it's in some of the earlier slides that I mentioned. But I had also indicated that there are 1 or 2 impact evaluations that we're working on at the moment, including the early grade reading study. So yeah, various approaches. The second one talks about data security. Yes, am I correct?
Sorry, yes, I was muted.
Okay. Data security. So because these were driven by the department and the two departments within government, there were no real issues around data security. In that in terms of procurement, if we got a service provider who worked with us, and they worked with us, in a lot of cases, people assume that the external service provider knows everything about evaluations and we don't have to do anything, we'll just get the report, etc. That wasn't the case. They don't know. As an evaluator, you really need to know the program, the people who run the program, the relationships, the institutional arrangements that make the program work or not work, to be able to make an evaluation of that program. And I think people underestimate how important that is. So we built in the data confidentiality protocol into the service provider responsibilities, but within the department anyway, most of the administrative data that they used, they got from us and handed over to us at the end of evaluation of the service provider relationship. The third thing, yes, absolutely, negative findings. So the whole idea of getting these findings is not just to get the positive findings, to get the negative findings, to get the requirements for improving implementation. So we had negative findings around waste, for instance, in the nutrition program, the issues of not having an information system that actually from the point of receiving the bursary right through to placement, and possibly even after placement. The colleagues I know have been thinking about tracking people through that receive bursaries to find out what their eventual destinations are. So a lot of the negative findings we were able to use as improvement points to help to improve and that's how we sold it, to help to improve the program. Not perfect, it's still a work in progress in a lot of cases, but they are there. The nutrition program used the negative findings as an agenda for action. And so they have 6 or 7 work streams that took groupings of the recommendations, whether it's in terms of infrastructure, the meal offering, procurement processes, etc., and use those as work streams. They use quarterly to improve their work planning and their operations in the system. They've been doing that for 2 or 3 years now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ian, I think the next couple of questions can go to you. The first one, perhaps on your previous experience, maybe not so much from the book itself, is can you explain the steps to establish an evaluation culture in government institutions at regional level? And perhaps linked to that somewhat is evaluation use seems to relate to having a champion at senior level. Any thoughts on how to go about identifying and fostering champions? Do you want to take these two before
Yeah. So one of the things that we have done is to, you do need senior managers to buy into why evaluation is important. And so one of the things we've done in South Africa is we've run training for over 300 of the top 3 levels of the public service in why evidence is important, and then the role of monitoring and evaluation within that, and very much looking at learning. And this was an advocacy course to try and get them to realize why evaluation is important. And directly as a result of this, departments that were somewhat reluctant to do evaluations decided to participate and take on some significant evaluations, including National Treasury, Home Affairs, Justice and Correctional Services, so important departments. So that's the one aspect. I do think also where you have an evaluation, an M&E champion in government like Uganda does, like Benin does, like South Africa does, it's their responsibility to try and cultivate this culture. And so this course, for example, has also been run in Uganda. It's also been run in Benin. Deputy ministers participated in Benin to try and stimulate this interest, and I think it's a key component, going forward. In terms of champions, I mean, I think again, the job of the central unit in government is to try and find those departments and those program managers who are interested to take this forward. We've done it in the book. Actually, chapter 4 is about performance culture in Uganda, Benin, and South Africa. And we found that around 50% of managers are open to learning and 50% are fearful and reluctant. So you need to find that 50% who are open to it, and then you start with them. You don't start with all the problematic ones. So one of the key jobs I feel as a sort of policy entrepreneur is trying to find those people. It's the gold is in those people who have the interest and the drive to make something happen, to do something for the common good.
Thanks, Ian. And the next couple of questions relate very much to the book. The first is a comment. Based on the presentation made, there's a need for a push on lessons learned, and comment on whether or not the project can be replicated, improved, or continued. This would address the life after or continuation forecast. And there's a question from somebody else, is what are the most significant lessons about evidence-informed policymaking that the book authors take from this case relative to the other very rich cases from across Africa that are included in the book? So Ian, do you want to speak to those?
So I think, Mina and I we're active at the moment in trying to look at follow-up, and what we're trying to see is which governments and which are interested in taking forward, trying to apply these lessons. So we're talking to Uganda, we're talking to Kenya, we're talking to Ghana, amongst others, to try and see where there's an interest to take it forward. And what we would like to do is work with them over 2 to 3 years to try and apply these lessons and develop out of that, better codifying of the types of courses, like the course that I mentioned with the top 3 levels of the public service. We want to now enrich that with the lessons from the book and the cases, because the other thing is we now have cases from 8 African cases where we have videos, we have policy briefs that are coming, so we can start to do our advocacy and training now with very rich African examples. In terms of this case, I think one of the things it brings out very strong, well, it's 2 things really. One is the importance of a national evaluation system. You saw, we went rather quickly over that slide, but we saw that there were a number of use interventions which were brought on by the national evaluation system. And so if you can have a good national evaluation system which is utilization focused, it will push many elements which promote evidence use, like Carol mentioned about evaluation steering committees, that the major stakeholders are part of it, so they feel they're directing what happens with the evaluation, they feel they have ownership, etc. So, and the other significant lesson is, again, the importance of internal knowledge brokers. So DPME, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, has played an external knowledge broker role, but what was impressive in the DPE case is the very strong internal knowledge broker role played by Carol and her team. And this is, this has really been very powerful in terms of the way they negotiate the policy process, the way they're able to find strategic opportunities to bring evidence into the policy process, and the way they're actually able to generate and support evidence processes themselves. I think those are 2 of the key takeaways from this particular case.
Thanks, Ian. The next 2 questions are related to recommendations. Perhaps you could respond to them. One is advice on how to produce more feasible recommendations. And the second, which also perhaps Carol can step in cases where the government felt that the recommendations were expensive or not doable, how did you tackle that? Were there areas of compromise in terms of implementation? What follow-up did you do?
I did see that comment. I just wanted to look again what it says in, I think it was asking about advice on how to produce more feasible recommendations. I think because unlike in the usual case of evaluations where you have recommendations, I think as the ultimate, sort of like the end of the report, the 2 evaluations after the reports were drawn out, from recommendations they moved into other steps which are part of requirements that have been put in place by the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, which include improvement planning reports, which means then that the department that is responsible for that report, evaluation report, goes back to the drawing board and identifies which parts of the recommendations they agree with and they are willing to take on as recommendations. So and take on as to improve the implementation of that particular program, as mentioned in the evaluation report. So I think for me that model is, whilst it can be a bit quite cumbersome, but I think it does help in leading recommendations into deliverables that can now be implemented and traced to see if they have really led to improved outcomes as had been made as a recommendation. And from improvement plan, it then leads to other platforms such as reporting to even higher committees at parliament level or at levels that are at cabinet level approval. And then that could be quite helpful. Also, knowledge management comes into play as well with the production of turning those policy recommendations also and making sure that you present them in the form of policy briefs and other smaller, other shorter documents that potential users outside even the concerned department can look into. So that's what comes off my head at the moment in terms of what could be used as turning recommendations into more feasible, making them more feasible for use.
Thanks. And Dave also points out that involving stakeholders in drafting recommendations encourages acceptance.
I agree.
Carol, do you want to add anything to this, Carol?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things. I think that's why. I mean, I'm getting from even some of the comments. There's usually contestation in the policy space between the evaluators' recommendations and the program people. And what we didn't want to do, we went out consciously to not do that. These were stimulated from within. They were meant to improve and to be used, and therefore feasibility was already built into the possibility for evaluation. For instance, one of the evaluations, program managers wanted us to make recommendations on the best modality of funding, for instance, and we had to say, well, no, this is not really a funding evaluation of different funding models. This is actually an evaluation of how we're doing the work. So the feasibility already was designed of the recommendations was taken into account as we went along with terms of reference, but also expectations for what the evaluation is and is not. So that's the one thing. And can I make a final comment on the evaluation?
Yeah, please.
Look, I think that even just talking about that contestation, I think what was very stark that came out of the evaluation process was the use of information and what data and information is used within the organization. That helps the evaluation context. It helps the receptiveness to evaluation and evaluative thinking, and also it helps program managers to really own the evaluation as theirs rather than imposed from outside. And that's very, very, very important in this methodology, if you like. Thanks.
Thanks. And perhaps linked to that, there's a question on evidence use and how we defined use in the study and what types of use we analyzed in the study. And I'll just speak to that quickly. We looked at all types of use. The cases we saw different types of use emerging from each of the cases. So we saw instrumental use in, I think, all of the cases where, a tangible action or concrete action was taken as a result of the evidence. We saw examples of conceptual use where, strengthening the understanding of the evidence users in a particular issue. A symbolic use, really reinforcing pre-existing views, and in this case we saw positive symbolic use, and as well as process use, I think a lot of which comes out from these two examples. I think that's all of the questions. Forgive me if I've missed any, or if I have missed any, then please raise them, because it jumps around a fair bit. But thank you all. These were really great questions. Sorry.
Thank you, Mine. I think we need to close the webinar now. The time is over. We went a bit beyond, but it was very good. So are we ready to close now? Yeah?
Yes, from my side, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So colleagues, thank you very, very much for your participation and your engagement. The questions have been really rich, and a special thanks to the speakers, Carol, Netson, and mine, and Ian. Thank you very much to our partner, CLEAR Anglophone Africa, for making this webinar possible, and EVALSDGs and UNICEF as the organizers. Also, thank you very much. As we have mentioned in different times by different means, the recording of this webinar as well as the presentation will be shared with you in the coming days. Congratulations, dear presenters, and I wish you a very nice evening in your case. Thank you so much.